Okay, 7th grade, so we are back in our reading packet again today. Today is our last day of school before summer break. So we're just going to finish off those questions from yesterday. Sorry, I will go ahead and put the reading in here right after this. So if you need to go back and listen to me read it again, you can, but if not, you can skip ahead past that just to me explaining the questions. But since we did do this yesterday, I think you should probably listen to it again just to get that information. So let's go ahead and we'll read it, and then I will come back to this page and we'll go over these together. Oliver Twist's 9th birthday found him a pale, thin child, somewhat diminutive in stature, and decidedly small in circumference. But nature or inheritance had implanted a good sturdy spirit in Oliver's breast. It had plenty of room to expand, thanks to the spare diet of the establishment, and perhaps to this circumstance may be attributed his having any 9th birthday at all. Be this as it may, however, it was his 9th birthday, and he was keeping it in the coal cellar with a select party of 2 other young gentlemen, when Mrs. Mann, the good lady of the house, was unexpectedly startled by the apparition of Mr. Bumble, the beadle, striving to undo the wicket of the garden gate. "Goodness gracious, is that you, Mr. Bumble, sir?" said Mrs. Mann, thrusting her head out of the window in the well-affected ecstasies of joy. Now Mr. Bumble was a fat man, and choleric, so instead of responding to his open-hearted salutation in a kindred spirit, he gave the little wicket a tremendous shake, then bestowed upon it a kick which could have emanated from no leg but a beadle's. "Lor, only think," said Miss Mann, running out, for the 3 boys had been removed by this time. "Only think of that I should have forgotten that the gate was bolted on the inside on account of them dear children. Walk in, sir, walk in, pray, Mr. Bumble, do, sir." Although this invitation was accompanied with a curtsy that might have softened the heart of a churchwarden, it by no means mollified the beadle. "Do you think this respectful or proper conduct, Mrs. Mann?" inquired Mr. Bumble, grasping his cane, "to keep the parish officers awaiting at your garden gate when they come here upon partial business with the partial orphans? Are you aware, Mrs. Mann, that you are, as I may say, a partial delegate and a stipendiary?" And with these words, just to interject here, with these words, with these little numbers here, like 4, stipendiary is someone who receives a stipend or salary from performing a service. So it gives you the definition of any of these words with the 4, or the numbers next to it. So choleric is ill-tempered, which means he has a bad temper. A beadle is a parish peace officer. "I'm sure, Mr. Bumble, that I was only telling 1 or 2 of the dear children as is so fond of you, that it was you a-coming," replied Mrs. Mann with great humility. Mr. Bumble had a great idea of his oratorical power and his importance. He had displayed the one and vindicated the other. He relaxed. Well, Mrs. Mann," he replied in a calmer tone, "it may be, as you say, it may be. Lead the way in, Mrs. Mann, for I come on business and have something to say." "And now about this business," said the beadle, taking out the leathern pocketbook. "The child that was so half-baptized Oliver Twist is 9-year-old today." "Bless him," interposed Mrs. Mann, inflaming her left eye with the corner of her apron. "And notwithstanding an offered reward of £10, which was afterwards increased to £20, notwithstanding the most superlative, and may I say supernatural exertions of the part of this parish," said Bumble, "we have never been able to discover who is his father, or what his mother's settlement, name, or condition." He added, "Oliver being now too old to remain here, the board have determined to have him back into the house. I have come out myself to take him there, so let him see me at once." I lost my spot. There we go. "I'll fetch him directly," said Mrs. Mann, leaving the room for that purpose. Oliver, having had by this time much of the outer coat of dirt which encrusted his face and hands removed, as could be scrubbed off in one washing, was led into the room by his benevolent protectress. "Make a bow to the gentleman, Oliver," said Mrs. Mann. Oliver made a bow, which was divided between the beadle on the chair and the cocked hat on the table. "Will you go along with me, Oliver?" Mr. Bumble said in a majestic voice. Oliver was just about to say that he would go along with anybody with great readiness when, glancing upward, he caught the sight of Miss Mann, who had got behind the beadle's chair and was shaking her fist at him with a furious contentiousness. He took the hint at once, for the fist had been too impressed upon his body not to deeply impress upon his recollection. "Will she go with me?" inquired poor Oliver. "No, she can't," replied Mrs. Bumble, "but she'll come and see you sometimes." This was no very great consolation to the child. With the slice of bread in his hand and the little brown cloth parish cap on his head, Oliver was then led away from Mr. Bumble, from the wretched home where one kind word or look had never lighted the gloom of his infant years. And yet he burst into agony of childish grief as the cottage gate closed after him. Wretched as were the little companions in misery he was leaving behind, they were the only friends he had ever known, and a sense of loneliness in the great wide world sank into the child's heart for the first time. Okay, so now that we've read over that, what we're going to do here is just go through these questions, walk through them. I'll explain the questions, nothing more than that. So that's all we're doing here today. Again, this is our last day before summer break, so this is all you have left to do, and then you are smooth sailing. So this says, read the sentence from paragraph 21. And yet he burst into agony of childish grief as the cottage gate closed after him. So why does Oliver feel grief? Is it because he's leaving behind his only friends? Because he does not want to go to work? Because he's afraid of Mr. Bumble? Or because his birthday party is interrupted? Well, we've already said yesterday that he's not having a really extravagant birthday party, right? So he's not really upset that his birthday party is being interrupted, right? Is he going to work? No, I don't think we've read anything about him going to work. So, because he doesn't want to go to work is not the answer. So, does he feel sadness because he's leaving behind his only friends or because he's afraid of Mr. Bumble? If you're not really sure, I would go back and read the end of the story because it tells you why he's sad. So, 9 says, one of the central ideas in the passage is that Mrs. Mann is unkind to the children. Excuse me. Select 2 sentences from the passage that best support this idea. "Laura only thinks," said Miss Mann, running out, for the 3 boys had been removed by this time. "Only think of that." B. With the slice of bread in his hand and the little brown cloth parish cap to his knees, Oliver was then led away by Mr. Bumble from the wretched home where one kind word or look had never lighted the gloom of his infant years. C. Bless him, interposed Mrs. Mann, inflaming her left eye with the corner of her apron. D. Oliver, having had by this time so much of the outer coat of dirt which encrusted his face and hands removed, as could be scrubbed in one washing, was led into the room by his benevolent protectress. E. He took the hint at once, for the fist had been too often impressed upon his body not to be deeply impressed upon his recollection. So you need to pick 2 that best support the idea. So let's eliminate a couple that don't support that idea. We'll go ahead and eliminate 2, and then from the 3 that are left, you can pick which 2 best support the idea. If they're referring to her as a benevolent protectress, well, first, what does benevolent mean? Well, if we go back here, it tells us at the bottom that benevolent means harmless. But in this case, it's used as irony to point out that Mrs. Mann tries to appear harmless, but in reality treats him cruelly. Well, here we can't necessarily see the irony. So here it's saying that she's a harmless protector. So she takes care of him, is what it's saying. Well, that doesn't support the idea that she is unkind to him, right? So we're going to go ahead and eliminate that one. Now, what's another one that we could eliminate? Well, if we look and it said, Laura only think the 3 boys had been removed by this time. Only think of that. Is that saying anything about how she's treated Oliver? No, it doesn't really say anything about that. So between B, C, and E, you need to decide which of those 2 best supports the idea that she's not kind to the children. And especially for E, when it's talking about the fist, that's because she's standing behind the peace officer, shaking her fist at Oliver, like telling him that he should tell him he doesn't want to leave. Okay? So that the context of those is also important. So let's go ahead and move on to page 50. If it says, if Oliver were the narrator of the story, how would it be different? So what would it mean if Oliver was the narrator? That he's the one telling this story. So it would say, I did this and then I did that. It wouldn't say Oliver did this and Oliver did that. It would mean that Oliver is telling the story himself. So how would it be different? A, it would include more details about Mrs. Mann's thoughts. B, the reader would learn more about Mr. Bumble's job. C, the reader would learn more about who Oliver's parents are. Or D, it would include more details about Oliver's feelings. Let's go ahead and eliminate 2 here. Is it going to say more details about Mrs. Mann's thoughts if Oliver's the one that's narrating it? No, because Oliver is inside of Mrs. Mann's head, right? So he wouldn't know what Mrs. Mann's thinking. Okay? Now, does anyone know who Oliver's parents are? No, Oliver doesn't even know who Oliver's parents are, because he's been in this orphanage since he was a baby. So he doesn't know who his parents are. So just because he's narrating it doesn't mean he would know anything about his parents. So either, if Oliver was narrating it, it's either that the reader would learn more about Mr. Bumble's job, or it would include more details about Oliver's feelings. So I think this one's pretty obvious here, but yeah, this one's a little bit more simple than some of the other ones. So 11 says, identify a theme of this excerpt from Oliver Twist. Support your answer with 2 details from the excerpt. So you need to go ahead and pick a theme. So if we look back at the story, what is one of the overarching themes that's in there? What is a theme again? Well, a theme is the lesson that you can learn from the story, right? So what sort of lesson are we learning here? That's what you have to figure out. I think there's a few that we could take away here. If we look here at the end, we can think about how he's sad that they were the only friends he'd ever known. You could say something about friends and loneliness, but you need to be able to support that. You could say one of the themes could be that, because there can be more than one, what could be a theme about Mrs. Mann? Well, a theme about Mrs. Mann could be that people aren't always what they seem, right? Because the peace officer thinks Mrs. Mann seems like a really nice lady because that's how she presents herself to him. But then when he leaves, she's really unkind to the children, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Just a couple ideas of what you could do. Now, as always, I'm just going to do a little bit of an example. We need to be doing the race strategy. So that would be restate, answer, cite, and explain. So if we were going to do that, the theme is that people aren't always what they seem. We could say one theme from Oliver Twist, which would be in italics, but I don't have the ability to do that, is that people are not always who they appear to be. One piece of evidence that supports, and you need to have 2 details, so that would be 2 pieces of evidence. So one piece of evidence that supports this is that, and then what would one thing that Mrs. Mann did support the idea that she's unkind to the children? Well, if we think one piece of evidence that supports this, if we think about when Oliver said he had been struck by Mrs. Mann's hand, we could say is that Oliver says he has been struck by her hand many times. And then you can even put the quote. So if we go back here, I know the quote is like right up here. For the fist had been too often impressed upon his body. So we could say, if we're using the ellipses that we've talked about before, for the fist had been too often impressed upon his body. And then we need to explain it. So we would say this shows that Mrs. Man has beat the children, but when the beetle is around, she acts much more kind. So then you would need to have at least one more detail to support that. Like I said, you could do a different theme for Oliver Twist because there's more than one theme. This is just one idea of a theme that you could talk about. So this is all you need to do for today since we finished up that writing packet early. If you guys need any help with this, please let me know. Like I said yesterday, I hope you guys are staying safe. I miss you guys. I hope you've had an okay time doing this e-learning. And I hope you have a great summer. And I'll see you back, hopefully, in the class in the fall.